Story 1. The Singing Bird Smugglers of Edo. You find yourself transported back to Edo, Japan in the middle of the 18th century. Imagine walking through the narrow, bustling streets of the shogun's capital, where merchants cry out the day's wares, where the aroma of grilled fish and miso mingles with the faint perfume of incense drifting from temple courtyards. The city was alive with order, yet humming beneath that order was a quiet chaos, a black market, hidden in plain sight. Silk, the most coveted textile in the archipelago, was at the heart of this underground world. By decree of the Tokugawa shogunate, foreign silk imports were heavily restricted, and certain varieties were banned outright. The aim was simple: to protect Japan's domestic silk industry and maintain the strict hierarchy of status and wealth that defined Edo society. Commoners were forbidden from wearing silk garments, which were reserved for samurai, courtiers, and wealthy merchants who could afford to bend or conceal the rules. But in practice, silk flowed like water through hidden channels. Contraband Chinese silk, softer and more lustrous than local varieties, was in constant demand. Merchants and smugglers knew that where there was prohibition, there was opportunity. And in this strange underworld of contraband, an unlikely ally emerged: the humble songbird. Birds as companions and symbols. Birdkeeping in Edo was more than a pastime. It was a sign of refinement. Aristocrats and wealthy townsmen delighted in cages of nightingales, warblers, and white-eyes, their clear voices filling tea-houses and homes. Special competitions, called yudaidori, pitted birds against each other in contests of song, with wagers quietly exchanged in the audience. The bird trade was robust, with specialized craftsmen producing elaborate cages of bamboo, fitted with tiny feeding trays and carved perches. To own a bird was to participate in an aesthetic tradition linked to poetry and performance. The nightingale, or yugisu, was celebrated in waka poetry as the herald of spring. The waidai, or mejiro, became so popular that entire markets were devoted to their trade. A cage was both practical and ornamental, a work of art that hung in tea-house alcoves or swayed gently in garden courtyards. It was into this culture of birdsong and bamboo that smugglers slipped their illicit cargo. The mechanics of concealment. A bird cage at first glance seems the least likely vessel for hiding silk. It is too small, too fragile, too conspicuous. And yet, precisely because it was so ordinary, it drew little suspicion. Inspectors at checkpoints along the highways leading into Edo were trained to examine rice shipments, barrels of sake, or bales of fabric. They rarely gave much thought to a man carrying a cage draped in cloth, from which the chirping of a nightingale could be faintly heard. Smugglers exploited this oversight with meticulous craft. Beneath the layer of seed and straw in a bird's feeding tray, a false bottom might conceal a tightly folded strip of silk. In more sophisticated designs, double-walled cages hid layers of fabric pressed so thin they appeared no thicker than the bamboo slats themselves. Birds were trained to continue singing despite the cramped additions, providing a reassuring air of innocence to their unsuspecting guardians. One Edo period record describes a magistrate in Kyoto uncovering a cache of silk hidden in bird cages meant for the spring market. The smugglers, it was noted, had woven the forbidden cloth into the very bones of the cages. This phrase, both literal and poetic, underscores the ingenuity of the operation. The highways and the inspectors. To enter Edo, merchants had to pass through a system of checkpoints called sekisho, strategically placed along major highways such as the Takedo. These checkpoints were designed to control the movement of weapons, women of high rank, and contraband goods. Inspectors were empowered to open cargo, demand travel permits, and detain suspicious travelers. And yet corruption was endemic. A discreet payment of coins, tucked into the sleeve of an inspector, might ensure a smooth passage. Sometimes the bribe was silk itself, a strip of contraband discreetly offered to the very man tasked with its seizure. At other times, inspectors simply turned a blind eye. The shogunate's bureaucracy was vast, but its reach was imperfect. Bird cages, as long as they appeared ordinary, rarely drew such scrutiny. The cheerful sound of a bird's song may even have provided a kind of auditory camouflage, soothing the inspector into passing the traveler with little more than a nod. The case of the Kyoto merchants. One case that filtered into official records around 1745 tells of a group of Kyoto silk merchants who sought to move a shipment of contraband Chinese silk into Edo. These men were legitimate traders in part. Their front business involved the sale of bird cages and songbirds, a trade respected enough to mask their darker dealings. Their scheme was daring in its simplicity. Inside each of a dozen cages was a prized nightingale, its plumage brushed to perfection, its song rehearsed for the journey. Beneath the straw at the base of the cage lay folded pieces of silk, each carefully dyed and pressed. At first glance, a buyer might assume it was no more than bedding for the bird. But in truth, each cage carried silk worth more than the bird itself. The merchants made their way along the highway, presenting their travel permits when required. At several checkpoints, they passed without incident. But at the barrier of Hakone, one of the most heavily guarded Sekisho, their luck faltered. An inspector, perhaps suspicious of the number of cages, ordered them opened. The report claims that when the cages were dismantled, the birds cried out as if in protest, their songs disrupted by the unmasking of the hidden cloth. The contraband was seized, the merchants detained, and the birds confiscated as evidence. The incident was entered into the magistrate's ledgers as an example of deception masked by beauty. Punishments and consequences. The Tokugawa shogunate did not treat smuggling lightly. While punishments varied, those caught in serious offenses could face exile, forced labor, or even death. For merchants, the disgrace of exposure was often as damaging as the sentence itself. Families could be ruined, businesses dismantled, and reputations erased from the social fabric of the city. In this case, records suggest the merchants were stripped of their licenses and their goods confiscated. Their families likely bore the brunt of financial ruin. As for the birds, their fate is unrecorded, though one imagines they were quietly resold into the markets from which they had come. The broader web of smuggling. This story was not unique. Across Edo, smuggling took countless forms: rice bales with hollowed centers, tea chests with false bottoms, fishing boats carrying forbidden luxuries under their ketch. But the bird cage method stands out precisely because it harnessed something beloved and innocent, turning it into a vessel for deception. Smugglers thrived on this principle. The more ordinary the object, the less likely it was to be questioned. Bird cages, children's toys, even religious artifacts could be repurposed as camouflage for contraband. The line between commerce and crime blurred in these small acts, where survival and ambition outweighed obedience to distant laws. A world of appearances. Edo society was obsessed with appearances. Clothing signaled class, accessories revealed wealth, and even the quality of one's bird cage spoke volumes about refinement. In such a world, silk was more than fabric, it was a symbol of aspiration. To wear forbidden Chinese silk was to quietly declare oneself above the rules, to embody elegance outlawed by decree. The merchants who smuggled silk in bird cages were not masterminds of grand conspiracies, but participants in this culture of appearance. They gambled on discretion, believing that beauty itself, the song of a nightingale, the craftsmanship of a bamboo cage, could cloak their transgression. And for a time it worked, until it didn't. Unresolved ending. As you consider the image of these cages, with birds singing above silken contraband, you're left to wonder, how many such shipments passed unnoticed? How many cages were never opened? How many fortunes were built on the back of feathers and forbidden cloth? If one group was caught, how many more were successful? When the Kyoto merchants were caught with their cages of silk and contraband, the case became a cautionary tale whispered among traders. Yet in Edo, whispers rarely stopped the flow of goods. If anything, exposure of one method often prompted smugglers to become bolder, more inventive, and more difficult to catch. For the magistrates, this presented a dilemma. How could they balance vigilance against ingenuity? And for the smugglers, the game was always one of outpacing the inspectors, hiding wealth in places least expected, pushing the boundaries of concealment while maintaining the delicate illusion of normality. The rise of the Sekisho culture. Checkpoints, or Sekisho, had long been fixtures of Tokugawa governance. Their official function was to prevent weapons from moving unchecked and to control the movement of high-ranking women, particularly those from daimyo families who might be used as political hostages. Over time, however, their purpose expanded to include surveillance of contraband goods. By the mid-18th century, Edo's inspectors had become increasingly aware that trade bans had created flourishing underground networks. They began keeping logs of seized items, cataloging where they were found, how they were concealed, and which merchant families were implicated. The case of the birdcages was dutifully recorded, with detailed sketches of the bamboo frames and false bottoms. But there was a problem. For every seizure that made it into the ledgers, dozens more never came to light. Travelers were clever, and inspectors were overworked. With thousands of people moving daily along the highways, it was impossible to check every package, every bundle, every cage. So smugglers adapted not by abandoning their methods, but by diversifying them. Birds and beyond, expanding concealment. The bird cage trick did not vanish after Hakon. Instead, smugglers refined it. Some began weaving silk threads directly into the straw bedding, so that it appeared no different from ordinary nesting material. Others trained birds to perch calmly on top of hidden packages, reducing the likelihood of discovery during cursory inspections. At the same time, other objects joined the repertoire of concealment. Wooden sandals, or geta, were hollowed out to carry rolled strips of cloth. False compartments were carved into tea chests, religious statues, even musical instruments. One particularly inventive case from 1762 involved merchants hiding silk inside the hollow reeds of flutes, carried openly as if they were traveling performers. The ingenuity of these operations reflected not only desperation, but also a cultural fascination with craft and precision. Edo smugglers were artisans of deception. Still, the bird cage remained iconic, a symbol of how everyday beauty could become a mask for forbidden profit. Investigators adapt. Magistrates, however, were not idle. As reports of bird-related smuggling spread, inspectors began to scrutinize cages more carefully. Manuals for checkpoint officers were updated with lists of common concealment tricks. Training exercises taught them to dismantle objects, probe false bottoms, and watch for nervous behavior in travelers. But inspectors also faced their own dangers. Excessive zeal could alienate merchants, damage reputations, or provoke retaliation. A harsh inspection of a wealthy merchant's goods might backfire politically. Corruption was rampant. Some inspectors accepted bribes to look the other way, while others actively colluded with smugglers, providing warnings of upcoming raids in exchange for a share of the profits. This tension created a gray zone of enforcement. In theory, bird cages were now suspect. In practice, enforcement depended heavily on the personalities of individual inspectors, their susceptibility to bribes, and the political climate of the time. Smuggling as survival. It is tempting to imagine smugglers as villains or profiteers, but the reality was more complex. For many, smuggling was not simply greed but survival. Taxes on silk and other luxuries were crushing. Legal channels for trade were monopolized by powerful guilds or sanctioned merchants with direct shogunal approval. Smaller traders, craftsmen, or rural peddlers often had little choice but to bend the rules. A single roll of smuggled Chinese silk could support a family for months. The risk of punishment was real, but so was the risk of starvation in legitimate trade. In this sense, The bird cage method reflects the pragmatism of ordinary people caught between law and necessity. Birds themselves were commodities. Their cages were common possessions. By transforming them into vehicles of smuggling, merchants leveraged the most mundane aspects of daily life to carve out a space in an unforgiving economy. The role of guilds. Merchant guilds played a quiet but significant role in these operations. While officially sanctioned by the shogunate, guilds often operated as semi-clandestine networks, regulating prices, protecting members, and facilitating trade that skirted the edge of legality. Some guilds tacitly supported smuggling as a way to bypass restrictions. A guild might provide resources for concealment, share intelligence about checkpoint activity, or arrange bribes for inspectors. In return, profits were distributed among members. The birdcage smugglers were not isolated actors, but nodes in a wider web of commerce and complicity. Their arrests, when they occurred, rarely destroyed the network. Others stepped in, refining techniques, diversifying concealment, and perpetuating the cycle. Cultural echoes. Interestingly, bird-related smuggling left traces not only in legal records but in culture. Satirical prints of the time, known as ukiyo-e, occasionally depicted merchants with cages, their expressions exaggerated in knowing winks to the audience. One anonymous woodblock, discovered in the 19th century, shows a merchant feeding a bird while a strip of silk peeks out from beneath the straw, a quiet mockery of both the smugglers and the inspectors who failed to notice. Such prints suggest that the practice was widely known, if not openly discussed. It became part of Edo's collective imagination, the idea that even the gentlest creatures might perch above layers of deceit. Inspectors, suspicion, and public anxiety. As awareness grew, inspectors sometimes overreacted. Stories circulated of honest bird keepers being harassed at checkpoints, their cages dismantled, their pets distressed. For ordinary townsmen who kept birds purely for song and companionship, this created resentment. Why should their harmless hobby invite suspicion? This tension illustrates the wider anxiety of Edo society. The shogunate's rigid system of rules often criminalized ordinary desires for beauty, for comfort, for social mobility. Birdcage smuggling was just one small example of how people resisted these restrictions. But for every cage opened by an inspector, countless others passed untouched, feeding the quiet paranoia that the law could never fully control the flow of goods. A crime that sings. One magistrate's diary from the late 18th century records his frustration. The birds sing, yet behind their voices lies the silk that bleeds the treasury. We seize one merchant and two more rise in his place. The cages are too many, the birds too restless, and our inspectors too weary to pierce every layer of deceit. This lament captures the futility of enforcement. Birdcage smuggling, like so many forms of contraband, was less about isolated cases and more about the impossibility of total control. As long as silk remained valuable and restricted, people would find ways to move it even if it meant perching it beneath feathers and song. Toward a larger crackdown. By the closing decades of the Edo period, the shogunate grew increasingly anxious about its ability to control commerce. Economic pressures, foreign contact, and domestic unrest made enforcement more urgent. Inspectors were ordered to intensify their scrutiny, and smugglers faced harsher punishments. Yet this escalation had unintended effects. The more severe the crackdown, the more ingenious the concealment. Bird cages evolved into just one part of a larger toolkit of deception, overshadowed but never forgotten. Unresolved ending. So we return to the central puzzle. Did these measures actually stop the flow of silk, or did they merely push smugglers to adapt in ever more ingenious ways? The magistrates recorded their victories, but their ledgers tell only half the story. For every cage dismantled, how many more were never noticed, their birds singing cheerfully as their owners walked unchallenged into Edo? The tale of the singing bird smugglers does not end at Hakone, nor with the frustrated magistrates who scrawled their complaints in diaries. Like all crime that flourishes under prohibition, it found its natural lifespan in the shifting tides of politics, economy, and culture. What began as a clever trick with cages and songbirds eventually faded not because inspectors eradicated it entirely, but because history itself outpaced it. To understand this decline, you must first consider the broader context. The slow unraveling of Tokugawa control, the shifting market for silk, and the winds of foreign influence that blew open Japan's carefully guarded gates. The waning of the bird cage method. By the early 19th century, smuggling through bird cages had become a known quantity. Inspectors were on alert. Manuals circulated that listed suspicious objects, and cages appeared prominently on those lists. Smugglers, pragmatic as always, adapted by shifting to other means. Fishing boats became more common carriers of contraband, slipping silk beneath baskets of squid or inside hidden compartments carved into hulls. River traffic along the Sumida became a favored route, as goods could bypass certain checkpoints altogether. Meanwhile, false-bottomed chests, hollowed sandals, and hidden rolls within legitimate silk shipments took precedence over the once ingenious cages. But this does not mean the bird cage smuggling vanished completely. For smaller operators, those without access to larger networks or resources, the cage remained a convenient option. A lone peddler with 2 or 3 songbirds could slip through where larger caravans drew suspicion. The practice lingered like an echo, quieter, less daring, but not entirely gone. The shogunate's shifting priorities. For the Tokugawa authorities, priorities changed as the century advanced. By the 1820s and 1830s, Japan faced growing internal crises: famine, peasant uprisings, and mounting debt in the shogunate's coffers. Smuggling still mattered, but enforcement resources were stretched thin. Inspectors could not be everywhere, nor could they devote themselves entirely to silk when rice riots threatened stability. This shift in focus gave smugglers breathing room. Some checkpoints grew lax again, with bribes once more determining outcomes. The cycle of vigilance and neglect repeated itself. Yet the bird cage remained a symbol, remembered more for its ingenuity than its prevalence. Foreign pressure and new horizons. The mid-19th century brought an upheaval greater than any inspector's vigilance. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay with his black ships, demanding Japan open its ports to foreign trade. Within a few years, treaties forced open the country, flooding markets with goods once tightly restricted. Suddenly, Chinese silk was no longer an illicit prize but a commodity traded through official channels. The elaborate networks of smugglers that once hid fabric beneath straw or inside cages found themselves obsolete. Demand did not vanish, but prohibition did. And without prohibition, there was no contraband. Bird cage smuggling, once ingenious, was reduced almost overnight to a historical curiosity. The fate of the smugglers. What became of those who risked everything for silk hidden under feathers? The records are uneven, as they so often are. Some families ruined by seizures disappeared from the ledgers entirely, their names erased by disgrace. Others adapted, shifting from illicit trade to legitimate business as new markets opened. A few stories suggest that former smugglers became middlemen in the new era of free trade, their networks repurposed for sanctioned commerce. The skills they honed, concealment, negotiation, bribery, were easily adapted to the murky world of early Meiji trade, where foreign merchants and Japanese entrepreneurs jostled for advantage. The birds themselves. Their role faded back into innocence. By the late Edo and early Meiji periods, bird keeping was once again just a pastime, its association with smuggling fading into memory. Cultural memory. Though bird cage smuggling dwindled, its place in Edo's cultural memory endured. Satirical poems and prints continued to circulate, poking fun at the notion of silk beneath feathers. In some kabuki plays, side characters were portrayed as bumbling smugglers carrying birdcages, used for comic relief. More seriously, the story lingered as a metaphor. To say someone kept silk beneath their bird became a phrase implying hidden wealth or secret dealings. Even in laughter, crime left its mark on language. Lessons for investigators. For the magistrates and inspectors of Edo, the birdcage cases carried lasting lessons. They demonstrated that crime was not confined to shadowy alleys or dangerous weapons. It could perch in the open, chirping sweetly, overlooked precisely because it was ordinary. This realization shifted investigative practice. Inspectors were trained to distrust appearances, to look twice at the ordinary, to dismantle even objects that seemed harmless. In some ways, this legacy influenced later Japanese policing, where attention to detail and suspicion of the mundane became ingrained in investigative culture. Reflection: ordinary crimes, extraordinary ingenuity. What makes the story of the singing bird smugglers so enduring is not its scale. The profits were modest compared to the grand schemes of daimyo or international traders, but its intimacy. These were ordinary merchants, using ordinary objects to commit crimes that blended seamlessly into daily life. There were no bloody murders, no daring heists in the night, just cages, birds, and fabric. Yet within that quiet simplicity lay ingenuity, desperation, and defiance. It reminds you that crime is not always loud. Sometimes it sings softly, concealed beneath feathers, hidden in plain sight. As the Meiji era dawned and Japan rushed headlong into modernization, the birdcage smuggling cases faded into archives and anecdotes. But their lesson lingers. Wherever rules restrict desire, people will find ways to bend them. Even in the song of a bird, the rustle of feathers, and the creak of bamboo slats, one might hear the faint echo of silk forbidden, folded and smuggled into history. Story 2. The counterfeit button scandal in Victorian London. You step into London in the 1840s, a city roaring with industry, yet creaking under the weight of inequality. Steam engines thunder, coal smoke hangs low over soot-blackened buildings, and the clatter of horse-drawn carriages fills the air. Factories churn out fabric and garments by the mile, clothing the booming population. But in this world of rapid change, even the smallest detail of dress, the humble button, could carry enormous weight. Buttons, to the Victorian mind, were not mere fasteners. They were symbols of identity, class, and aspiration. A gentleman's coat might sport brass or gilt buttons engraved with elaborate designs, while a working man's jacket relied on plain wooden or horn fasteners. For the poor, buttons were precious commodities, often salvaged from worn-out garments to be reused again and again. A missing button was not simply a nuisance. It was a small but telling marker of poverty. In such a climate, the button became fertile ground for fraud. The world of button makers. The button trade in Victorian London was immense. Factories in Birmingham, known as the City of 1,000 Trades, produced millions of buttons every year from metal, bone, mother of pearl, and shell. London tailors and clothiers depended on this supply chain, and so too did the customers who expected their garments to be not only functional but fashionable. Buttons were subject to regulation, particularly military buttons. Regiments were assigned specific designs, and supplying counterfeit versions was a crime of forgery. Beyond the military, guilds and manufacturers sought to protect their trademarks, stamping buttons with insignias that guaranteed authenticity. It is within this world of mass production and strict codes that counterfeiters found their niche. By crafting imitation buttons, often indistinguishable from the real thing, they infiltrated markets across the city, from respectable clothiers to back-alley stalls. A small crime with big ripples. At first glance, counterfeiting buttons seems laughably trivial compared to bank forgery or jewel theft. But the scandal that emerged in the 1840s revealed how such small frauds could undermine entire systems of trust. Soldiers in the British Army were issued coats with official buttons, but when counterfeit versions began to circulate, confusion arose about uniforms and supply chains. For civilians, counterfeit fashion buttons threatened reputations. To be caught wearing a poorly made imitation, whether knowingly or not, was a humiliation. For manufacturers, counterfeiters cut directly into profits, destabilizing markets already squeezed by industrial competition. The scandal began quietly with inspectors in London's clothing markets noticing irregularities. Buttons stamped with well-known trademarks were found to be peeling, their gilt flacking away after only a few days' wear. Soldiers reported buttons that snapped under strain, unfit for the rigors of service. The question loomed: who was making these false buttons, and how far did their network extend? The discovery in Whitechapel. One of the earliest breakthroughs came in Whitechapel, an East End district infamous for overcrowding and poverty. There, police raided a modest workshop after a tip from a disgruntled tailor. Inside, they found molds, presses, and trays of counterfeit buttons, hundreds of them, stamped with the insignias of military regiments and reputable London clothiers. The workshop was run by a family of artisans who had once made legitimate goods but had fallen on hard times. By shifting to counterfeit production, they could sell buttons at half the usual price, drawing in desperate buyers from poorer districts. But the scandal reached further. These were not isolated forgeries, but part of a web of distribution, with counterfeit buttons traveling through peddlers, markets, and even some unscrupulous clothiers willing to turn a blind eye for higher profit margins. Investigative methods. Victorian investigators faced a daunting challenge. Unlike forged currency, which could often be spotted by inconsistencies in print or paper, counterfeit buttons were remarkably convincing. The differences lay in subtle details: the weight of the metal, the crispness of an insignia, or the durability of the gilt finish. Inspectors developed rudimentary tests, weighing buttons against known standards or filing edges to reveal inferior metals beneath. They interviewed tailors and shopkeepers, tracing supply chains back to workshops. Slowly, a picture emerged of a network that spanned beyond Whitechapel, touching Birmingham factories, London markets, and even docks where shipments of raw materials were intercepted. The counterfeit button trade was not about individual fraudsters, but about a shadow economy that paralleled the legitimate one. The broader impact. The scandal reached the newspapers, which seized on the story with a mix of outrage and ridicule. The Times ran editorials decrying the button brigands, who undermined the honor of British uniforms. Satirical prints showed soldiers, coats bursting open in the middle of battle as counterfeit buttons gave way. Cartoons lampooned the idea that national security could be undone by something so small. Yet behind the humor was a serious concern. If counterfeiters could infiltrate something as mundane as buttons, what did it say about the vulnerabilities of Britain's booming industrial economy? Trust in goods, once assumed, could no longer be taken for granted. The arrests and questions. Several counterfeiters were arrested, including the Whitechapel family and a handful of distributors. But the scale of the trade suggested many more remained at large. Trials revealed the difficulty of prosecution. Juries were reluctant to convict on what seemed a petty matter, even as manufacturers pushed for harsher sentences. The authorities faced an uncomfortable truth. They could seize workshops and prosecute individuals, but they could not fully stop the trade. As long as poverty persisted, counterfeit buttons would find a market. Unresolved ending. And so the scandal lingered, unresolved in the public mind. The arrests answered some questions but left others hanging. How many counterfeit buttons remained in circulation? How many coats in London's crowded streets carried fasteners that were, in fact, fraudulent? The scandal was not just about crime, but about trust in an industrial age. If something as small as a button could not be trusted, what else in daily life might be counterfeit? The Waitekapel raid had opened the door, but behind it stretched a corridor of unanswered questions. London authorities had seized trays of forged buttons, presses, and molds, but who was truly responsible for flooding the city with counterfeits? A single workshop could not account for the volume being reported. The investigation revealed not just a petty fraud, but a system that mirrored London's industrial complexity itself. The investigators challenged. For inspectors, the counterfeit button scandal posed a unique challenge. The crime was small in scale, yet vast in its reach. One or two false coins could pass through a shop unnoticed, but counterfeit buttons had a way of multiplying silently. Once sewn onto coats, they spread through the city like invisible parasites. Tracing a button backward was difficult. A tailor might say he purchased a batch from a market vendor. The vendor might insist he received them from a wholesaler in Birmingham. The wholesaler might claim his factory had been undercut by a cheaper source, and so the trail stretched endlessly, often collapsing under deliberate obfuscation. One inspector later described the work as chasing phantoms stitched into cloth. Military concerns. Among the most vocal complainants were the military. Official uniforms carried distinctive regimental buttons, not merely decorative but symbolic of discipline and honor. When counterfeit versions began appearing on soldiers' coats, it struck at the heart of military pride. Worse still, inferior buttons snapped during drills or corroded in damp weather, leaving uniforms in tatters. Commanders petitioned Parliament, demanding stricter enforcement and heavier punishments. For them, the issue was not just about money, it was about order, morale, and the image of Britain's army. If soldiers could not trust the very buttons on their coats, what did that say about the state's control over supply chains? Courtroom drama. The first major trial of the scandal unfolded at the Old Bailey in 1846. The defendants were members of the Waitekapel family, whose workshop had been raided months earlier. They stood accused of forgery, fraud, and conspiracy. Prosecutors laid out their case with precision. They produced molds seized from the workshop, matching them to counterfeit buttons collected from markets. They brought in military officials who testified to the inferiority of seized buttons. They even demonstrated before the court how the counterfeit buttons snapped under pressure compared to authentic ones. Yet the defense was equally shrewd. They argued that the family were skilled artisans simply producing buttons for sale, unaware they infringed on protected insignias. They pointed out that poverty had driven them to desperation, that their goods provided affordable clothing fasteners to the poor. Was this truly a crime worth ruining an entire family for? The jury hesitated. Though the defendants were convicted, sentences were relatively lenient compared to the harsh penalties sought by manufacturers and the military. The outcome sent a mixed message. Counterfeiting buttons was illegal, but perhaps not the monstrous crime officials insisted it was. The guild's influence. Behind the prosecutions loomed the powerful merchant guilds and manufacturers' associations. For them, the scandal threatened more than honor, it threatened profit. Birmingham's button makers, already squeezed by industrial competition, saw counterfeiters as parasites eating into their margins. They lobbied aggressively for harsher punishments, stricter inspections, and government backing. In pamphlets and petitions, they framed the issue as one of national integrity. A coat, one petition declared, is only as honest as the buttons that fasten it. They argued that counterfeiting buttons undermined the reputation of British industry abroad, jeopardizing exports as much as domestic sales. Yet for London's working poor, such rhetoric rang hollow. For them, counterfeit buttons provided access to styles otherwise unaffordable. A laborer could wear a jacket adorned with shining gilt buttons, passing as more respectable than his wages allowed. To criminalize such access felt to some like protecting the rich at the expense of the poor. Class tensions. This tension between legality and necessity played out in the streets. In poorer districts, counterfeit buttons were no secret. Market stalls sold them openly, sometimes alongside legitimate goods. Buyers knew the difference but often didn't care. To them, buttons were not about authenticity but about appearance, and appearance could mean opportunity. A man in shabby clothing might be turned away from work, but with a coat adorned with bright buttons, he could pass muster. A young woman might wear a jacket with counterfeit decorations, hoping to appear more refined at church or in the dance hall. Buttons, small though they were, became symbols of aspiration. The scandal thus highlighted not only crime but class struggle. Was it truly criminal for the poor to grasp at dignity, even if through counterfeit means? Or was it exploitation by counterfeiters profiting from desperation? Press and public opinion. The press, as always, shaped the scandal's narrative. Some newspapers echoed manufacturers' outrage, calling for a crackdown. Others treated it with mocking humor, publishing cartoons of soldiers bursting from their uniforms or dandies, humiliated when their coats fell apart. But more radical voices used the scandal to critique industrial capitalism itself. They argued that the obsession with authenticity and trademarks served only the wealthy, while the poor were criminalized for trying to imitate respectability. To them, the counterfeit button was a symbol of hypocrisy, a system that condemned fraud while relying on exploitation. Public opinion was divided. Some saw counterfeiters as thieves, others saw them as folk heroes resisting a rigged economy. Investigative expansion. In the years following the Whitecapel raid, investigators expanded their efforts. Raids were conducted in Birmingham, uncovering small-scale operations where legitimate workers moonlighted as counterfeiters. Warehouses along the Thames were searched for illicit shipments. Still, the problem persisted. For every workshop shut down, another emerged. Buttons were too easy to produce, too cheap to distribute, and too widely demanded to control effectively. Inspectors lamented the futility of their work. One wrote in his report, "For every press we seize, two more spring up in alleys we cannot patrol. The crime is as endless as the buttons themselves, countless, ordinary, and ever circulating." Toward a broader scandal. By the late 1840s, whispers suggested that the counterfeit button trade was tied not only to poor artisans, but also to larger networks of corruption. Some inspectors hinted that wholesalers knowingly mixed counterfeit goods with legitimate shipments. Others suspected that even certain military suppliers turned a blind eye, padding profits while claiming ignorance. The scandal was no longer about a single workshop. It hinted at a shadow economy woven directly into the legitimate one, impossible to fully untangle. Unresolved ending. And so the question lingered. Was the counterfeit button trade truly a crime to be stamped out, or a symptom of deeper inequalities in Victorian society? Were the culprits the artisans hammering out false fasteners in dim workshops, or the wealthy manufacturers who left no room for survival outside their monopoly? The courts gave answers, but never enough. The inspectors seized molds, but never enough. The buttons themselves, scattered through the coats of London's millions, remained a silent reminder that crime often lies stitched into the fabric of ordinary life. By the time the 1850s dawned, the counterfeit button scandal had worn itself into the public consciousness. What began as scattered rumors of poor-quality fasteners had swelled into trials, raids, and headlines. And yet, like so many quiet crimes of the industrial age, its resolution was neither clean nor decisive. Instead, it dissolved into a blend of partial reforms, lingering suspicions, and cultural memory. The crackdown intensifies. In the wake of the Old Bailey trials, Parliament pushed for tighter controls on uniform and trademarked goods. Military buttons were to be manufactured only by authorized suppliers under strict oversight. Inspectors were empowered to conduct more frequent checks in London markets, and to impose heavier fines for traders caught with forged fasteners. The button-making guilds, particularly those in Birmingham, celebrated the new rules as a victory. Pamphlets proclaimed that British craftsmanship would no longer be sullied by counterfeiters. They envisioned a market cleansed of fraud, where authenticity was guaranteed and trust restored. But the reality was far less tidy. Enforcement remained inconsistent, and counterfeit workshops proved remarkably resilient. Raids uncovered new presses in alleyway sheds, often run by the very same families previously convicted. Penalties, while harsher on paper, were still meted out unevenly, depending on the sympathies of juries and the influence of guild backers. The human side of the crime. Court records from the late 1840s and early 1850s show a familiar pattern. Families of artisans hauled before magistrates, accused of counterfeiting buttons, pleading poverty in their defense. Many were not hardened criminals but displaced workers, men and women, driven out of legitimate trades by mechanization or wage cuts. Counterfeiting was a way to keep food on the table, however risky. One testimony from a woman arrested in Spitalfields captures the human cost. "My husband was a button maker in Birmingham, but his shop closed. We came to London for work and found none. I pressed buttons at night while the children slept. They say it is fraud, but what is worse, to make false buttons or to let children starve?" The court sentenced her to months of hard labor, but her words echoed beyond the courtroom, fueling public debates about poverty and responsibility. Guilds versus the poor. The guilds, for their part, doubled down on their rhetoric. They portrayed counterfeiters as threats to national integrity, undermining not only trade but morality itself. They insisted that every false button worn by a soldier or civilian eroded trust in Britain's industrial superiority. But radicals countered with scorn. They accused guilds of protecting their profits under the guise of patriotism, while doing little to alleviate the poverty that made counterfeiting appealing. Pamphleteers drew sharp contrasts between wealthy manufacturers and destitute families convicted for pressing cheap imitations in damp workshops. The counterfeit button thus became a symbol not merely of fraud, but of the gulf between classes. It represented the struggle of the poor to imitate respectability, and the determination of the rich to guard their monopolies. Military reforms. For the military, the scandal had immediate consequences. Regulations tightened, and procurement systems became more centralized. Contracts were awarded to trusted manufacturers with closer oversight, and uniforms were inspected more carefully before distribution. In the long run, this helped professionalize supply chains, reducing the prevalence of counterfeit goods in military contexts. But it also increased costs, which were inevitably passed down to taxpayers and, indirectly, to soldiers themselves. The Army's response, while effective in curbing one aspect of the scandal, highlighted the delicate balance between efficiency, trust, and expense in an expanding empire. Fading into the background. By the mid-1850s, the scandal had lost its urgency in the press. Larger issues dominated: political reform, public health crises, and the looming specter of conflict abroad. Counterfeit buttons, once headline fodder, became a quieter affair, relegated to local courts and the occasional market raid. Yet the practice never entirely disappeared. Even as late as the 1870s, records mention counterfeit buttons surfacing in East End markets. They were no longer a scandal but a nuisance, tolerated as part of the fabric of urban poverty. Cultural echoes. Though the scandal faded from courts, it lingered in culture. Satirical journals like Punch occasionally mocked button brigands in cartoons, long after the public had moved on. Novels of the era, fascinated by the interplay of crime and class, sometimes referenced counterfeit goods as symbols of deceit and aspiration. Buttons themselves became metaphors. To wear false buttons entered slang in some circles, meaning to present oneself as better than one's means. The phrase captured both the humor and tragedy of a society obsessed with appearances. Lasting lessons. What then did the counterfeit button scandal teach Victorian society? At one level, it was about the vulnerabilities of industrial trade. Even something as trivial as a button could expose cracks in supply chains, showing how easily trust could be undermined by fraud. At another level, it was about class and survival. Counterfeit buttons thrived not because of criminal genius, but because of poverty. They offered the poor a way to grasp at respectability, to wear the illusion of dignity in a society where appearance was everything. For the authorities, the scandal underscored the limits of enforcement. You could raid workshops, seize presses, and prosecute families, but as long as inequality persisted, the counterfeit trade would return, stitched into the fabric of urban life. Reflection: small crimes, big meanings. As you reflect on the scandal, consider how it blurs the line between triviality and importance. A button is a small thing, easy to overlook. Yet in Victorian London, it carried layers of meaning of class, trust, survival, and deception. The counterfeit button scandal reminds us that crime is not always about grand heists or violent acts. Sometimes it is about the smallest details, the fasteners on a coat, and the quiet desperation behind them. It invites you to ask, in your own daily life, how many things do you take for granted as genuine? And what happens if they are not? Story 3. The Salt Smugglers of the French Pyrenees. Imagine yourself in the French Pyrenees in the mid-18th century. Snow clings to the peaks even in spring, while valleys below are dotted with stone cottages, terraced fields, and the constant ring of sheep bells. Life here was harsh but steady, built on pastoral rhythms of grazing, wool, and cheese-making. Yet behind this tranquil scene lay one of the most resented impositions of the French crown: the gay bell, the salt tax. Salt in survival. Salt in this era was not a luxury but a necessity. It preserved meat, kept butter from spoiling, and seasoned the simplest meals. For peasants, salt was as essential as bread. Without it, survival became precarious. The French monarchy understood this too well. By the 14th century, it had imposed the gay bell, a tax that monopolized salt distribution and forced citizens to buy fixed quantities at inflated prices from official depots. The gay bell varied by region, and in some areas, particularly in southern France, rates were cripplingly high. In the Pyrenees, where families lived close to subsistence, the gay bell was despised. To refuse it was treason, to evade it was survival. And so, salt smuggling flourished. Geography of smuggling. The Pyrenees were an ideal landscape for contraband. Narrow passes threaded between peaks, forests provided cover, and borderlines blurred into invisible ridges and valleys. Spain, just beyond the mountains, offered cheaper salt, harvested from coastal flats and less burdened by taxation. Smugglers carried it across hidden routes, sometimes on muleback, sometimes strapped to their own bodies beneath layers of clothing. The trade was as old as the tax itself, and by the 18th century it had become a way of life. Entire villages participated, whether by carrying loads, hiding contraband in barns, or simply turning a blind eye. The criminalization of the ordinary. What is striking about salt smuggling is not its daring, but its ordinariness. Housewives, shepherds, and children all took part. A peasant woman might carry a few pounds of salt concealed under a basket of eggs. A shepherd might lead a flock that hid bags of contraband beneath their wool. For the French state, this turned ordinary villagers into criminals. Salt guards, known as gabelets, patrolled roads and searched homes. They had the authority to arrest, fine, and imprison anyone caught with untaxed salt. To many villagers, the gabelets were not guardians of law, but oppressors, symbols of royal greed trampling on rural survival. The tactics of smugglers. Smugglers developed ingenious methods. Some disguised salt as flour, packed into sacks indistinguishable at a glance. Others hid it inside hollowed logs, carried openly as firewood. Mules were trained to walk narrow night paths, guided only by whispered commands, their loads wrapped to silence the clink of crystals. Children played their part too. A boy running down a village lane with a ball of cloth might be carrying salt stitched into the seams. Because children drew less suspicion, they often slipped past Gabeless with small but steady contributions to the trade. The ingenuity of these tactics blurred the line between crime and everyday life. Smuggling was not a separate activity, it was woven into the fabric of survival. The state's response. The Crown was not blind to this defiance. The Gabeless were expanded in number, their patrols intensified and punishments harshened. Smugglers could face heavy fines, imprisonment, or, in extreme cases, forced labor in the galleys. But repression bred resentment. In villages, Gabeless were despised, sometimes attacked or even killed. Ballads mocked them, telling stories of clever peasants outwitting clumsy guards. In taverns, the word salt itself became a symbol of rebellion, whispered with knowing nods among those who resisted the Gabel. One local saying captured the sentiment: better to face the mountains than the king's salt. A case in the high passes. One particularly well-documented case took place in 1768, when a group of smugglers attempted to carry Spanish salt through the high pass near Cauteretz. According to records, the group consisted of men, women, and even 2 teenagers, each carrying small sacks. Their plan was simple: move by night, avoid the main road, and descend into the valley by dawn. But a patrol of Gabeless, tipped off by an informer, ambushed them. A scuffle broke out. The smugglers scattered, some vanishing into the trees, others caught and bound. The seized salt weighed nearly 200 pounds, a fortune by peasant standards. The captured smugglers were paraded into town, their sacks displayed as evidence. The punishment was swift: fines beyond their ability to pay, and in some cases, imprisonment. For their families, it meant ruin. And yet the very next week, new smugglers took the same path. The trade did not stop. Collective resistance. Salt smuggling was not just individual defiance but collective action. Villages often pooled resources, hiring strong men to make runs into Spain and dividing the spoils. When Gabeless arrested a smuggler, neighbors sometimes banded together to pay fines or smuggle salt in greater quantities to compensate. In some regions, entire communities turned against the salt guards. Records describe ambushes where villagers pelted Gabeless with stones, forcing them to retreat. In such moments, the line between crime and rebellion blurred. Smuggling salt became not just an economic act but a political statement, a rejection of the Crown's authority in favor of communal survival. The brewing storm. By the late 18th century, resentment toward the Gabel had reached a boiling point. Pamphlets denounced it, peasants rioted against it, and smugglers continued their quiet war in the mountains. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the Gabel became one of the most despised symbols of royal tyranny. Its abolition was cheered as a victory for common sense and justice. But before that revolutionary moment, smugglers in the Pyrenees carried on their nightly treks, balancing between survival and punishment, between loyalty to community and defiance of the state. Unresolved ending. So as you picture these villagers trudging through the snow with salt hidden in baskets, ask yourself, were they criminals or simply survivors? And how many of them, ordinary in every other respect, lived double lives as both loyal subjects and quiet outlaws? The story of salt smuggling in the Pyrenees was not one of isolated acts. By the mid-18th century, it had evolved into a persistent, low-grade war between the French crown and its own subjects. On one side stood the Gabeless, the salt guards, armed with muskets, warrants, and the full weight of royal authority. On the other stood villagers, shepherds, and muleteers, carrying little more than their wits, their knowledge of the land, and their determination to survive. It was a conflict fought in forests, on mountain passes, and in the narrow streets of rural towns, a conflict where the stakes were not wealth or glory, but salt itself, the quiet mineral that kept hunger at bay. The expanding force of the gabless. The French monarchy poured resources into enforcement. By the 1760s, thousands of gabless were deployed across France, with detachments stationed along the Pyrenean border. Their job was clear: intercept contraband salt before it reached French markets, seize smugglers, and make examples of them. Gabless patrolled roads on horseback, erected guard posts at key passes, and staged nighttime ambushes along trails suspected of carrying contraband. They searched homes without warning, overturning baskets and digging through barns. In some villages, the sound of gabless boots on cobblestones at dawn struck fear as much as any invading army might. But these men were not popular servants of the crown. They were seen as outsiders, parasites living off the fines and seizures they imposed. Their pay was meager, their work dangerous, and their resentment often matched that of the villagers they pursued. Corruption and collusion. Not all gabless enforced the law with zeal. Corruption ran rampant. Many accepted bribes to look the other way or struck deals with smugglers to share profits. Some actively collaborated, tipping off smugglers about upcoming patrols in exchange for a cut of the trade. This created an atmosphere of uncertainty. A smuggler never knew whether the gabless he met would be an enemy or a secret ally. Likewise, villagers sometimes found themselves betrayed when a guard who once accepted payment suddenly enforced the law with severity. The corruption only deepened public cynicism. If the system could be bought, why should anyone respect it? The smuggler's ingenuity. Faced with intensifying patrols, smugglers refined their methods. Night journeys became the norm, with smugglers relying on starlight and memory to guide them through perilous trails. They employed decoys young boys sent ahead with small loads, meant to draw the attention of gabless while larger shipments slipped by unseen. Some concealed salt inside loaves of bread or molded it into blocks disguised as cheese. Muleteers developed secret signals, whistles, or bird calls to warn of approaching patrols. Women carried salt tucked beneath their skirts or stitched into bodices, relying on the reluctance of male guards to search them too closely. Each tactic reflected the creativity of necessity. Smuggling was less about daring adventure than about practical survival, the ability to think one step ahead of those who hunted you. Violence in the valleys. Despite the ingenuity, the struggle was not bloodless. Records tell of violent clashes between smugglers and gabless. Ambushes turned into skirmishes, where stones, sticks, and knives met muskets and sabers. In 1772, in the village of Aro, gabless attempted to seize a group of muleteers unloading Spanish salt. A crowd of villagers gathered, throwing rocks and driving the guards back. The confrontation escalated until one guard fired his musket, killing a young shepherd. The resulting riot forced the gabless to retreat entirely, their authority shattered. Such incidents fueled a cycle of anger and repression. Each death hardened resentment, each crackdown inspired more resistance. The line between criminal smuggling and political rebellion grew ever thinner. The informer problem. Perhaps the most despised figures of all were the informers, locals who betrayed smugglers to the gabless in exchange for rewards. Informers were often ostracized, shunned by their neighbors, and in some cases attacked. In one notorious case, an informer's house was burned to the ground after his testimony led to the imprisonment of 3 villagers. For the community, loyalty to neighbors often outweighed loyalty to the crown. Silence was a form of resistance. Even those who did not smuggle often hid smugglers, misdirected gabless, or simply saw nothing. The crime thrived because it was collective, sustained by an unspoken pact of complicity. The courts and punishments. When smugglers were caught, punishments were harsh. Courts levied fines far beyond what peasants could pay, forcing families into debt. Imprisonment was common, and repeat offenders sometimes found themselves sentenced to the galleys, chained labor on royal ships, far from their mountain homes. Yet these punishments rarely deterred. Villages often rallied to support the families of imprisoned smugglers, treating them as victims of injustice rather than criminals. Fines were shared collectively, burdens distributed among neighbors. In effect, punishment only deepened solidarity. The crown hoped fear would quash smuggling. Instead, it bound communities closer together in defiance. The symbolism of salt. By the late 18th century, salt had transcended its role as a commodity. It had become a symbol of oppression and defiance. To pay the gay bell was to submit, to smuggle was to resist. In tavern songs and folk tales, smugglers were cast as heroes, outwitting clumsy gabless and feeding their families in the process. Ballads celebrated their cunning, turning them into folk figures not unlike the highwaymen and outlaws of English lore. One verse from a Pyrenean ballad sang, "The king takes the salt from our tables, but the mountains give it back at night." Such songs turned crime into culture, embedding smuggling into the identity of the region. Toward the breaking point. As the 1780s approached, the gay bell became one of the most universally hated aspects of French governance. The Pyrenees were not alone across France. Peasants grumbled, smugglers thrived, and gabless were despised. What began as a local struggle was part of a national storm brewing toward revolution. In the Pyrenees, the conflict remained at a low simmer, but each raid, each clash, each trial added kindling to the fire. When revolution finally came, it would not be the aristocracy alone that peasants rose against, but also the taxes and enforcers that had turned daily life into a quiet war. Unresolved ending. And so you are left with this image. A line of villagers threading silently across a snow-covered pass, sacks of salt strapped to their backs, while in the valley below, gabless load their muskets, waiting. Neither side can give way. The smugglers must eat, the guards must enforce. The question lingers, was this truly a war against crime, or the early rumblings of rebellion against a system already cracking under its own weight? By the late 18th century, the struggle over salt in France had become more than a matter of taxation. It was a fault line running through society, a daily reminder that the monarchy's power reached even into the most basic necessities of life. In the Pyrenees, as in many other provinces, the quiet war between villagers and gabless never ceased. Each night a mule crept along a ridge with hidden sacks. Each dawn a patrol of guards marched through a valley. Each trial filled court records with the names of ordinary peasants turned criminals. When the revolution broke out in 1789, it was fueled by grievances as grand as liberty and as humble as salt. The fall of the gay bell. The gay bell was one of the first targets of revolutionary anger. Pamphlets denounced it as tyranny, and peasant petitions demanded its abolition. The National Assembly debated it fiercely, recognizing both the revenue it provided to the crown and the hatred it inspired among the people. In March 1790, the gay bell was officially abolished. It was a symbolic victory as much as a practical one. For centuries, the salt tax had marked the divide between rulers and ruled, between law and survival. Now, its removal was celebrated as proof that the revolution truly served the people. In the Pyrenees, villagers greeted the news with bonfires and feasts. Smugglers, once criminals, were suddenly vindicated. The sacks they carried were no longer contraband but simply goods, their defiance rewritten as foresight. The legacy of resistance. The abolition of the gay bell did not erase the memories of repression. For decades, families remembered the fines, the imprisonments, the deaths at the hands of gabless. Songs and stories preserved the defiance, casting smugglers as folk heroes who had resisted injustice before it was fashionable to do so. One oral tradition from the Ariège region tells of a grandmother who kept a small pouch of salt hidden in her hearth, refusing to cook with it until news of the abolition arrived. She then used it to season a celebratory stew, declaring that the king's salt would never again poison her table. Such tales, passed down, reinforced the idea that the people of the Pyrenees had always stood against oppression, their mountains serving as both refuge and battleground. What became of the Gables? The salt guards did not vanish overnight. Some were reassigned to other duties under the new government. Others melted away into the countryside, despised and hunted by the very villagers they once policed. In revolutionary fervor, attacks on former Gables were reported, as communities took revenge for years of intrusion and cruelty. The revolution turned many tables. The once powerful enforcers of the king's salt became fugitives in the very valleys they had patrolled. Their uniforms, once symbols of authority, were burned in village squares. Economic changes. With the Gabelle gone, salt prices dropped sharply. For many families, this was more than symbolic. It meant fuller meals, preserved meats that lasted through winter, and relief from a burden that had drained their scant resources for generations. Yet the disappearance of the Gabelle also disrupted the underground economy that had grown around smuggling. For some, smuggling had been a livelihood. With legality restored, their trade collapsed. Former smugglers turned to other work: mule driving, shepherding, or legitimate commerce with Spain. The networks of secrecy that had bound villages together shifted, but the memory of shared resistance lingered. Salt as symbol in the revolution. Salt itself took on a symbolic role in revolutionary rhetoric. Leaders pointed to the Gabelle as proof of the monarchy's corruption, attacks that criminalized survival. Pamphlets proclaimed, "The people shall never again be chained to the king's salt." In revolutionary festivals, salt was sometimes scattered in public squares as a gesture of freedom, reclaiming what had once been monopolized. For the first time in centuries, salt was simply salt, no longer contraband, no longer a symbol of oppression, but a common good. Memory in the Pyrenees. In the Pyrenees, stories of smuggling endured well into the 19th century. Grandfathers told grandchildren of night journeys through snow, of clever tricks that fooled the Gables, of neighbors who stood together against unfair laws. In some villages, annual fairs included songs that mocked the salt guards, keeping their memory alive long after their patrols had ceased. Folk tales blurred history and legend, portraying smugglers as cunning tricksters who outwitted arrogant officials at every turn. Salt became a metaphor for independence. To say someone kept his salt in local dialect was to say he kept his dignity, his refusal to bow. Lessons for the modern world. Looking back, the salt smugglers of the Pyrenees remind us how crime and resistance can overlap. What the crown called criminality, villagers understood as necessity, even justice. The Gabelle transformed survival into defiance, turning shepherds into smugglers and housewives into conspirators. Their story also reveals the limits of enforcement. Thousands of Gables, years of crackdowns, and countless trials could not extinguish the trade. The law was powerless against the collective will of communities determined to live on their own terms. And when the revolution came, it confirmed what smugglers had long known, that the law itself had been unjust. Reflection: the taste of freedom. Picture it: a Pyrenean family gathered around a hearth in 1790, sprinkling salt freely into their soup for the first time in living memory. No fear of search or seizure, no fines, no Gables knocking at the door. Just the taste of freedom, ordinary and extraordinary at once. The story of the salt smugglers is not one of daring riches or spectacular heists. It is the story of how ordinary people, through quiet defiance, helped erode the legitimacy of a monarchy. It is a reminder that revolutions are not only fought in assemblies and battlefields, but also in kitchens, mountain passes, and the daily struggle to eat. Closing thought. Salt may seem a small thing, as buttons were in London or bird cages in Edo. yet in its crystals lay the power to ignite rebellion. The smugglers of the Pyrenees remind you that history is not always made by kings and generals, but sometimes by shepherds trudging through snow with contraband on their backs carrying, quite literally, the seeds of revolution. Story 4. America's Cheese Rustlers of the 19th Century. If you picture rural America in the 1800s, your mind likely turns to cattle drives, gold rushes, and the gunfights of frontier towns. But in the rolling fields of upstate New York and the dairy-rich counties of Wisconsin, another story was unfolding, one less bloody but no less telling. It was the story of cheese rustling, the quiet theft of dairy wheels, wedges, and crates that had become a kind of rural currency. Cheese as commodity. In the 19th century, cheese was more than food. It was wealth, storable and transportable in an era before modern refrigeration. A single wheel, aged and hardened, could weigh 50 to 100 pounds and fetch a tidy profit in local markets or urban centers. Farmers often used cheese to settle debts, pay wages, or barter for goods. In places like Herkimer County, New York, or Greene County, Wisconsin, cheese production was industrial in scale. Farmers pooled milk into cooperative dairies, producing wheels by the hundreds. Barns and sheds became storehouses, stacked with aging wheels that represented months of labor and livelihood. To steal a cow was risky. The animal could be tracked, branded, or recovered. To steal a wheel of cheese, however, was simpler. It was already processed, easy to move, and nearly impossible to trace once it left the farm. Why rustling emerged. Cheese rustling grew from a mix of poverty, opportunity, and lax enforcement. Rural America in the 1800s was scattered with small farms, and lawmen were few. A sheriff might patrol dozens of miles, unable to guard every barn. For thieves, cheese presented a target that was valuable but rarely protected. Thefts often occurred at night, when barns stood silent and farmers slept. Thieves would roll wheels into wagons, cover them with hay, and disappear into the countryside. By morning, a farmer might discover that half his year's work was gone. Some thefts were small-scale, a few wheels taken for resale in the nearest town. Others were bold, involving wagon loads of cheese stolen for transport to larger markets, where the goods could vanish into the churn of commerce. The first recorded cases. One of the earliest documented instances occurred in upstate New York in 1851, when a farmer in Oneida County reported the theft of 12 wheels from his barn. The local paper mocked the crime with wry humor, calling it a dairy calamity. But for the farmer, the loss was devastating. 12 wheels could equal the profit from an entire season's labor. By the 1860s, as cheese production expanded, so too did theft. Newspapers in Wisconsin began reporting cheese bandits, and farmers formed local vigilance committees to patrol barns during harvest season. The crimes were rarely violent, but they cut deep. To steal cheese was to strike at the economic heart of a family, undermining their ability to pay debts, feed children, or invest in the next season's herd. Investigative challenges. Law enforcement struggled to adapt. Cheese was difficult to track. Unlike cattle, it bore no brand or unique mark. A wheel could be sold in a nearby town, consumed in a week, and leave no trace. Sheriffs relied on informants or the occasional careless thief who tried to sell stolen cheese too close to home. One Wisconsin sheriff lamented in an 1873 report, "A cow will bellow when taken, but a cheese wheel is silent. We find ourselves chasing ghosts that melt into markets before we can draw a warrant." Farmers grew frustrated. Some armed themselves and slept in barns during peak production, hopping to deter rustlers. Others hired guards or pooled resources to pay watchmen, yet the thefts continued. A rural economy in tension. Cheese rustling was more than crime, it was a symptom of economic tension. The rise of commercial dairies concentrated wealth in visible, vulnerable stockpiles. Poorer families, landless laborers and itinerant workers saw these stockpiles as tempting opportunities. To them, a wheel of cheese was not just food but survival, something that could be eaten, traded, or sold. This blurred the line between petty theft and organized crime. A hungry family stealing a wheel for the table was one thing. A band of rustlers hauling away wagon loads for profit was another. But to the farmer who lost his stock, the distinction mattered little. Cheese as symbol. In rural folklore, cheese sometimes became a symbol of cunning theft. Ballads and jokes poked fun at cheese rustlers, casting them as tricksters who rolled wheels down hills or outwitted sleepy farmers. Newspapers occasionally treated the crimes as comic relief, titling stories with puns like "Another Wheel Gone Missing" or "Bandits Strike at the Dairy Heart." Yet beneath the humor lay real hardship. For the families who depended on those wheels, rustling was not funny, it was devastating. A case in Wisconsin. In 1874, a particularly brazen theft made headlines in Greene County, Wisconsin. Thieves broke into a cooperative dairy and made off with nearly 800 pounds of cheese in a single night. The haul required wagons and careful planning, suggesting an organized group rather than desperate individuals. The sheriff pursued leads for weeks, but the cheese was gone. Some suspected the thieves had transported it to Chicago, where the bustling markets made stolen goods easy to blend in. No arrests were ever made. The cooperative suffered heavy losses, and local farmers increased their patrols, even setting traps for intruders. The case became emblematic of the problem. Cheese was too easy to move, too profitable to ignore, and too hard to police. Unresolved ending. So picture the scene. A farmer wakes at dawn, steps into his barn, and finds half his cheese wheels missing. No footprints, no trail, just empty shelves where his wealth once sat. Somewhere down the road, a wagon creaks under the weight of stolen wheels, headed for a market where no one will ask questions. And you are left to wonder, was cheese rustling a crime of greed, or simply another way in which the hungry and ambitious carved their place in a changing America? By the 1870s, cheese rustling had become a serious concern in rural New York and Wisconsin. Farmers who had once laughed at the odd missing wheel now saw entire barns emptied in a single night. What had begun as petty theft was evolving into organized crime, and rural communities were forced to reckon with the fact that their wealth, stored in dairy wheels stacked high, was as tempting a target as cattle herds or bank vaults. The rise of vigilance committees. In many rural towns, sheriffs and constables simply could not keep up. Distances were vast, manpower was thin, and cheese disappeared faster than warrants could be issued. In response, farmers organized vigilance committees, groups of neighbors who banded together to patrol barns, guard storehouses, and track suspicious activity. Committees worked in shifts, often armed with shotguns and lanterns, packing the outskirts of dairies through the night. Some installed makeshift alarm systems, tripwires tied to tin pans, dogs chained near entrances, even bells hung on barn doors. In certain towns, these committees went further, posting public warnings that thieves would face not only arrest, but also extra-legal punishment if caught. Notices in local papers carried stern language. Let all who would pilfer from the dairy be warned, the people of this county shall not suffer such crimes in silence. The thief shall find no refuge, neither in law nor in mercy. The committees were a blend of necessity and community pride, but they also reflected the weakness of formal law enforcement in rural America. Law enforcement struggle. Sheriffs, for their part, were caught in a difficult position. They lacked the resources to guard every farm, and when cheese was stolen, they faced immense pressure from angry farmers demanding action. But once a wheel was gone, there was little they could do. Unlike stolen cattle, which bore brands and could sometimes be traced across counties, cheese was generic. A wheel taken from one barn looked identical to a wheel from another. Without witnesses or confessions, proving theft in court was almost impossible. Some sheriffs resorted to stings, setting traps by planting marked wheels and watching to see who tried to sell them. Others relied heavily on informants, offering small rewards to anyone who could tip them off about stolen goods. Still, convictions remained rare. The courtroom battles. When thieves were caught, trials revealed the difficulty of prosecuting cheese rustling. Prosecutors had to prove not only that the cheese was stolen, but that the wheels in question were the same ones taken from a farmer's barn. Defense lawyers pounced on this uncertainty, arguing that their clients had purchased the wheels legitimately at market. In one New York trial in 1871, a farmer testified that the wheels seized from a suspect were his, "For I know their weight and smell." The courtroom erupted in laughter, and the defense argued that such testimony was insufficient. The jury acquitted the accused. Another case in Wisconsin saw a band of 3 men convicted after being caught red-handed, loading wheels into a wagon under cover of night. But even then, their sentence was light a fine and short jail terms, reflecting the jury's view that, while wrong, cheese rustling did not rank alongside violent crime. For farmers who had lost fortunes, these outcomes felt like insults. Justice, they believed, favored the clever thief over the honest dairyman. Organized rustling. As dairies grew larger and the cheese trade expanded toward urban centers, rustling operations became increasingly organized. Bands of thieves coordinated raids, targeting cooperatives that stored hundreds of wheels in a single warehouse. Reports surfaced of gangs who specialized in transport men with wagons strong enough to haul loads to rail depots, where stolen cheese could be shipped to Chicago, St. Louis, or New York. Once in the city, the wheels blended seamlessly into legitimate markets. Some farmers suspected that middlemen, distributors, and even unscrupulous merchants knowingly purchased stolen cheese. The scale of certain thefts suggested collusion far beyond a few desperate peasants. Cheese rustling in its organized form was a business. Economic ripples. Theft had broader consequences than individual losses. Insurance companies began charging higher rates for dairy stockpiles, cutting further into farmers' already slim profits. Cooperative dairies, fearful of raids, sometimes delayed production or restricted access to barns. The fear of theft even influenced farming practices. Some dairies shifted to selling butter, which was easier to store securely in smaller quantities. Others accelerated the shipping of cheese, moving wheels quickly to markets before thieves could strike. In this way, cheese rustling reshaped rural economies, pushing farmers to adapt not just to markets but to crime. Community suspicion. Perhaps the most corrosive effect of cheese rustling was the suspicion it bred within communities. Thieves often came from nearby neighbors, laborers, or itinerant workers familiar with local barns. Farmers who once relied on communal trust now eyed one another warily. Accusations flew, sometimes with little evidence. A man with a new wagon, a worker seen loitering near barns, or a family with more food than expected might draw whispers of theft. In some cases, false accusations ruined reputations, deepening divisions in small towns already strained by economic hardship. The cheese rustler was not always an outsider. More often, he was a familiar face, which made the crime sting all the more deeply. Vigilante justice. In rare cases, frustration boiled into violence. Vigilance committees, enraged by repeated thefts and failed prosecutions, sometimes took justice into their own hands. Rustlers caught in the act might be beaten, tarred, or run out of town. Newspapers occasionally reported such incidents with disapproval, but farmers defended them as necessary deterrents. The law, they argued, was too slow and too soft. Only the threat of community vengeance could keep thieves at bay. This blurring of lawful and unlawful punishment reflected the desperation of rural America, where the line between justice and survival was often thin. A crime both trivial and serious. To outsiders, cheese rustling seemed almost comical. Newspaper editors in urban centers poked fun at cheese bandits and published cartoons of farmers chasing rolling wheels down hills. But for the communities affected, the crime was deadly serious. A barn full of cheese could represent a family's entire livelihood, and to lose it overnight meant ruin. This duality crime that appeared trivial yet carried devastating consequences gave cheese rustling its peculiar place in the annals of rural crime. It was both laughable and tragic, both petty and profound. Unresolved ending. And so the image remains. A vigilance committee huddled in a barn, shotguns in hand, while outside, the countryside lies silent under moonlight. Somewhere beyond the fields, a wagon creaks under the weight of stolen wheels, already on its way to market. The question hangs in the night. Could law and community ever truly stop cheese rustling, or was it destined to persist, as long as wealth sat waiting in wheels of dairy gold? By the late 19th century, the great era of cheese rustling was drawing to a close. For nearly half a century, thieves had rolled, hauled, and smuggled away thousands of wheels from barns and cooperatives, leaving behind frustrated farmers and baffled sheriffs. What began as small thefts had blossomed into organized operations, only to fade again as America modernized. Yet even as the practice declined, its memory lingered in rural folklore, shaping the way communities understood crime, justice, and survival. The decline of cheese rustling. Several factors converged to bring cheese rustling under control. First and foremost was transportation. By the 1880s, improved rail networks allowed farmers to ship cheese more quickly to urban markets. Instead of storing hundreds of wheels for months at a time in vulnerable barns, farmers could move their product within days of production. This reduced the stockpiles that had once tempted thieves. Second was technology. Advances in preservation and refrigeration meant that cheese no longer needed to be hoarded in great quantities in one place. Butter and fluid milk gained popularity as well, diversifying the dairy economy and reducing reliance on massive cheese inventories. Finally, law enforcement itself evolved. Rural police forces expanded, vigilance committees passed their responsibilities back to sheriffs, and the legal system began to take property crimes more seriously. Court records from the 1890s show stiffer sentences for agricultural theft, reflecting society's recognition that these crimes, while non-violent, inflicted real economic harm. The farmer's perspective. For farmers, the memory of cheese rustling remained vivid. Some spoke of ruined years, when a barn full of wheels disappeared overnight and debts mounted beyond recovery. Others recalled nights spent in cold barns with shotguns across their knees, guarding against thieves who never came. In oral histories collected in the early 20th century, older farmers sometimes recounted rustling with a strange mix of bitterness and humor. One New York dairyman, interviewed in 1912, recalled, "We lost near 50 wheels one summer, rolled away in a single night. At the time it broke us near to begging. But now I laugh, thinking of those thieves straining their backs to lift what we had sweated to make." The pain of loss softened with time, but the distrust it bred lingered. For years afterward, rural communities remained wary of strangers and suspicious of neighbors. The rustler's fate. What of the rustlers themselves? Few left detailed records for obvious reasons. Some likely drifted into other forms of theft as opportunities changed. Others may have settled back into ordinary lives, their crimes forgotten or quietly forgiven by communities that often understood poverty as motive. In rare cases, rustlers became folk figures. Local legends told of daring raids, wagons slipping away under moonlight, and thieves who outwitted farmers and sheriffs alike. These tales often exaggerated the truth, but they gave rustlers a place in rural mythology, akin to trickster figures less villains than symbols of cunning and desperation. Cheese and the law. One lasting effect of the rustling era was a shift in how rural America thought about property and law enforcement. Before the mid-19th century, many communities relied on informal justice, trusting neighbors more than courts. The rise of organized theft, whether of cattle, horses, or cheese, forced farmers to demand stronger institutions. This pressure helped professionalize sheriffs, offices, and expand rural policing. Insurance markets, too, adapted, offering protection against agricultural theft and pushing farmers toward more secure practices. In a small but real way, cheese rustling accelerated the modernization of rural law. A crime of transition. Cheese rustling thrived in a period of transition when America was shifting from subsistence farming to commercial agriculture, from local barter to national markets. It was a crime born of abundance and vulnerability. Abundance, because farmers produced more than ever before. Vulnerability, because that abundance sat waiting in barns, unguarded, in a world not yet equipped to protect it. As the economy modernized, the opportunity vanished. The same railroads, markets, and technologies that made cheese profitable also made it less stealable. Rustling declined not because people stopped stealing, but because the crime no longer made sense. Folklore and memory. Even after its decline, cheese rustling lived on in folklore. Newspapers occasionally referenced it with humor, recalling the golden days when farmers chased rolling wheels down hills. In taverns and farmhouses, old men told stories of thieves who had slipped away under lantern light. In Wisconsin, where cheese remained a defining product, the memory took on a special character. Some communities joked that their wheels were so good, even thieves could not resist them. Others turned the history into cautionary tales about vigilance and the importance of securing one's livelihood. By the early 20th century, the rustling era had become a quaint story of the past, something to laugh at rather than fear. Yet beneath the laughter lay the memory of real hardship, families bankrupted, trust frayed, and communities tested. Reflection: the weight of ordinary crime. Cheese rustling may seem trivial compared to the robberies and murders that fill most crime histories, but its significance lies precisely in its ordinariness. It reminds us that crime is not always spectacular. Sometimes it is as quiet as a wagon creaking down a country lane, carrying away the wealth of a season's labor. For farmers, the loss of cheese was as devastating as the loss of cattle or cash. For rustlers, the theft was often not about greed but survival, a way to carve out existence in a hard rural world. In this sense, cheese rustling was not merely theft, it was a mirror of America's economic struggles, its shifting values, and its uneven progress toward modernity. Closing thought. So imagine the end of the 19th century, as railroads stretched across the Midwest and barns stood emptier than before. The age of cheese rustling was over, but the lessons remained, that even the most humble commodity could inspire crime, that communities could be torn between trust and suspicion, and that justice was often shaped less by the courts than by the people who lived with the consequences. And as you reflect, ask yourself, if a wheel of cheese could provoke such crime and conflict, what does that tell us about the fragile line between necessity and law, between survival and theft? Story 5. The Whispering Postmasters, Mail Theft in Rural England. Picture rural England in the early 19th century. Stone cottages cluster around market squares, hedgerows divide fields, and narrow lanes wind toward distant towns. In every village, one building stood as a lifeline to the wider world: the post office. Here, news arrived from London, fortunes traveled in banknotes, and lovers' promises crossed the miles in fragile envelopes. For villagers, the post was more than communication, it was connection, identity, and trust. Yet in that trust lay a vulnerability. Letters passed through human hands, and those hands were not always honest. The central role, of the village postmaster. In rural parishes, the postmaster was often a grocer, an innkeeper, or even a schoolmaster who had been granted the additional responsibility of handling the mail. He, or sometimes, she sorted incoming letters, sold stamps, and ensured delivery along the local routes. This was a position of immense trust. Villagers might know the postmaster by name, see him at church, or purchase goods from his shop. He was not merely an official but a neighbor. Yet this closeness was precisely what made the betrayal sting so sharply when mail theft was discovered. Letters as treasure. To understand the crime, you must understand the value of letters. In an age before telephones, letters carried not only words but wealth. Enclosed within folded sheets were banknotes, bills of exchange, and lottery tickets. Even seemingly mundane correspondence might contain small coins for relatives, jewelry tucked in cloth, or promises of money to be delivered. A single stolen letter could ruin a business deal, sever a romance, or destroy a reputation. The act of mail theft was not merely financial, it was intimate. It violated privacy, exposed secrets, and undermined the invisible thread that bound communities to each other. Temptations and opportunities. For rural postmasters, the temptation was constant. They handled every envelope, knew which letters looked heavy with coin, which bore the seals of banks or barristers. They could delay, open, and reseal without immediate suspicion. In some cases, theft was opportunistic, a single letter taken in a moment of desperation. In others, it became systematic. Certain postmasters skimmed from the stream of correspondence for years, growing bolder as their crimes went unnoticed. The opportunity was greatest in isolated villages, where oversight was rare and audits infrequent. A postmaster might operate for months without a visit from inspectors, free to tamper with mail as he pleased. Early cases. One early case recorded in the 1820s involved a postmaster in Shropshire, accused of intercepting letters containing small banknotes bound for local tradesmen. Suspicion arose when multiple merchants complained of missing payments. An investigation revealed that the postmaster had been opening letters late at night, carefully extracting the notes and resealing the paper with wax. When confronted, he claimed poverty had driven him to it. His family was starving, he insisted, and the temptation had been too great. The court showed little mercy. Mail theft was treated not merely as theft but as a betrayal of public trust. He was sentenced to transportation to Australia. Stories like his echoed across England, each one a warning that the integrity of the post was fragile, dependent not on locks or seals, but on human honesty. The Whisper Network. News of such betrayals spread quickly through villages. Gossip carried whispers. Did you hear? Letters are going missing at the post office. Trust eroded. Some villagers began sending money only by trusted couriers. Others sewed coins into clothing or concealed valuables in packages of flour or soap. Yet even suspicion could not break dependence on the post. For most, it remained the only link to distant family, trade, and opportunity. They had no choice but to trust, even as they doubted. The investigators. The General Post Office (GPO), headquartered in London, was acutely aware of these risks. To protect its reputation, it developed a network of surveyors and inspectors tasked with monitoring postmasters, auditing accounts, and investigating complaints. These men traveled the countryside, often undercover, sending test letters through suspect offices to see if they arrived intact. Their reports describe a methodical process. A letter containing a marked banknote would be posted through a particular village, and if it vanished, suspicion fell squarely on the postmaster. Arrests were swift, and courts handed down heavy sentences, often publicized in newspapers to deter others. But no matter how many convictions occurred, the problem never vanished. Each year brought fresh cases, each one revealing the same temptation and the same breach of trust. A crime of intimacy. What made these crimes so unsettling was their intimacy. A highwayman robbing a coach did so openly, with pistols drawn. A burglar breaking into a house left broken locks and shattered windows. But a postmaster stealing a letter did so in silence, from within the very institution meant to safeguard correspondence. For victims, the pain was personal. A merchant might lose a payment, but a wife might lose a letter from her husband at sea, or a mother the news of her child's health. These were not just crimes of money, but of memory, love, and connection. Unresolved ending. So imagine a quiet English village in the 1830s. The postmaster locks his shop at dusk, tucks a stack of letters under his arm and carries them home. Behind closed shutters, he examines each one, fingers tracing the seals, weighing the envelopes, listening to the whisper of paper that might conceal a fortune. The villagers trust him. But tomorrow, when a letter fails to arrive, who will they blame, the distant post roads or the man they see every Sunday in church? When letters began disappearing, it was not always clear where the fault lay. The postal network in 19th century Britain was vast, stretching from London through provincial towns into the smallest parishes. A lost letter might have been misplaced on the road, stolen by a coach robber, or delayed by weather. But when patterns emerged, when letters vanished again and again from a particular village, suspicion tightened like a noose. It was in these moments that the General Post Office sent in its most secretive weapon, the inspector. The work of the surveyors. Post office surveyors, or inspectors, were the detectives of their day. Dressed as ordinary travelers, they moved quietly through rural towns, carrying false letters designed to test the honesty of local postmasters. These letters contained marked banknotes, coded seals, or secret watermarks that could identify them if tampered with. The method was simple but effective. A letter was posted in London and routed through the suspect village. If it never arrived, investigators compared the point of disappearance with the route. Again and again, missing letters traced back to the same hands. Surveyors also examined the physical mail itself. They looked for envelopes resealed with unusual wax, paper that had been clumsily refolded, or ink smudges that suggested tampering. Even a faint trace of candle soot could be a clue, evidence of a postmaster steaming open an envelope at night. Case study: the Devon postmaster. One of the most famous cases occurred in Devon in the 1840s, when a respected village postmaster named John Richards fell under suspicion. For years, merchants complained that their payments were vanishing. At first, the GPO dismissed the claims as coincidence. But when a pattern emerged, nearly every missing letter passed through Richards' office. Inspectors set a trap. They posted a letter with a marked £5 note, sealed with a unique wax stamp. The letter never reached its destination. Days later, the marked note was discovered in circulation in Exeter, traced to a shopkeeper who testified that Richards himself had spent it. The trial at Exeter Assizes was sensational. Richards pleaded innocence, claiming he had received the note in change. But the evidence was damning. The jury convicted him, and he was sentenced to transportation for life to Australia. For his village, the shame lingered long after he was gone. Neighbors who once greeted him at market now spoke his name only in whispers, as though the betrayal had infected them all. The severity of punishments. The British state treated mail theft with extraordinary severity. Ordinary theft might earn a fine or a few months in prison. But theft of the post was considered an attack on national trust, undermining the very system by which commerce, governance, and private life functioned. Convicted postmasters faced years of hard labor, long prison terms, or transportation to penal colonies. Earlier in the century, some had even faced the death penalty for stealing from the post, though by the Victorian era this was commuted to exile. The harshness of the punishment reflected the fear. If people could not trust the post, they could not trust the state. Communities in shock. For rural villages, the discovery that their postmaster had been a thief was often devastating. This was not an anonymous highwayman, but a man they knew: the grocer who sold them flour, the innkeeper who poured their ale, the neighbor who stood beside them in church pews. When arrests came, shame spread through the village like smoke. Some families defended the accused, insisting he had been framed or driven to desperation. Others turned on him with fury, fearing their own letters had been stolen. Children grew up remembering the knock at the door when inspectors came, the sight of their neighbor led away in irons, and the silence afterward when the community tried to stitch back its pride. The role of poverty. Not every postmaster was a hardened criminal. Many were poor men and women, earning meager wages from the post office while trying to support large families. The temptation of a sealed envelope heavy with coin could be overwhelming. In testimonies, some confessed with tears. They had stolen not out of malice but out of hunger. "I opened it for bread," one Yorkshire postmistress told the court in 1839, after being caught with a letter missing 2 shillings. She was sentenced to 7 years' transportation. These cases revealed the uneasy truth that crime often arose not from villainy, but from desperation, and that the system's harsh punishments sometimes fell hardest on the most vulnerable. Inspectors as ghosts. To the people of the countryside, postal inspectors became figures of both fear and fascination. They were seen as ghosts drifting through villages, never announcing themselves until it was too late. A traveler staying at the inn might, in fact, be a post office spy. Rumors circulated of inspectors planting letters in unsuspecting villagers' hands, or of secret codes that could expose theft instantly. Whether true or exaggerated, such tales reinforced the idea that the post office's reach was everywhere, its watchful eyes inescapable. The whispers never ceased. Even after a conviction, suspicion lingered. A new postmaster might arrive, appointed by the GPO, but villagers eyed him cautiously. Would he prove honest, or would the letters again begin to vanish? Trust, once broken, was slow to return. In some communities, people continued to send sensitive letters by private couriers rather than through the official post, a practice that survived decades after the scandal that had inspired it. Unresolved ending. So imagine it: a candle-lit courtroom, a trembling postmaster standing in the dock, his neighbors watching in silence as the judge pronounces sentence. He is led away in chains, bound for prison or exile. The letters he stole are gone forever, their words scattered into nothingness. And yet the deeper question remains: how many others continued to tamper with the mail, undetected, their betrayals never exposed? By the middle of the 19th century, mail theft by rural postmasters had become a well-documented problem. Dozens of prosecutions, widely reported in local and national newspapers, had burned the lesson into public memory. The man who handled your letters might not be the man you thought he was. But while the courts could convict and the newspapers could shame, the larger question remained: how could a society rebuild faith in a system once shaken by betrayal? The harsh fate of the convicted. For those caught, the consequences were ruinous. Transportation to Australia remained a common punishment well into the 1840s. Convicted postmasters found themselves shipped thousands of miles from their homes, their families left behind to grapple with stigma and poverty. Some never returned. Prison was no kinder. Convicts endured years of hard labor in grim institutions like Pentonville or Millbank. A crime as simple as lifting a banknote from a folded letter condemned a man or woman to isolation, silence, and the endless breaking of stones. The shame extended to families. Children of disgraced postmasters often left their villages, unable to bear the whispers that followed them in schoolyards and markets. Wives struggled to survive, many forced to take charity from the very neighbors who had once trusted their husbands. Mail theft was not simply a crime punished by the state, it was a social death. Reforms in the post office. The General Post Office, keenly aware of the reputational damage, introduced reforms to prevent such betrayals from recurring. Stricter audits. Rural postmasters were subject to more frequent inspections. Books were checked, receipts tallied, and sudden visits kept them from feeling secure in dishonesty. Improved seals, envelopes, and packets were redesigned with stronger waxes and distinctive impressions that made tampering harder to conceal. Separation of duties in some villages. The handling of money orders and valuable correspondence was separated from ordinary post, reducing temptation by limiting access. Expanded use of decoy letters. Inspectors relied increasingly on test letters, scattering them through routes at random. Any disappearance triggered an immediate investigation. These measures did not eliminate theft entirely, but they did restore enough confidence for the public to keep relying on the post. A changing world. The penny post. The introduction of the uniform penny post in 1840 marked a turning point. With postage reduced to a penny, letter writing exploded across Britain. Millions of ordinary people now sent letters weekly, even daily. This surge in correspondence created both new risks and new safeguards. On one hand, more letters meant more opportunities for theft. On the other, the sheer volume of mail diluted suspicion and made patterns easier to spot. A missing letter was less easily dismissed when inspectors tracked thousands each month with statistical precision. Moreover, as the post became truly national, the role of the small, semi-independent rural postmaster diminished. Larger, more centralized offices took on greater responsibility, reducing the opportunities for individuals to tamper unseen. Communities after betrayal. For the villages themselves, the scars of betrayal lasted long after reforms. Oral histories from the late Victorian era reveal lingering suspicion. In some communities, elderly residents could still recall the postmaster led away in chains, their mothers whispering warnings never to trust sealed letters with money inside. Even decades later, families adjusted their habits. Money was sent through banks rather than the post. Love letters were wrapped in layers of paper, as if secrecy could be protected by thickness. The old wounds did not heal easily. The intimacy of the crime. Why did mail theft haunt communities so deeply? Because it was intimate. A burglary might take silverware. A highwayman might seize a purse. But a stolen letter took something more. Words meant only for you. To have those words intercepted by a neighbor was to feel exposed, stripped of privacy. Villagers often described their shock in personal terms. Not "I lost money," but "my letter was read." Even when nothing was stolen, the suspicion that eyes had wandered across their private thoughts left a permanent unease. In this way, the whispering postmasters inflicted not only financial harm, but emotional injury. They fractured the boundary between public trust and private life. The broader lesson. Mail theft forced the state to confront an uncomfortable truth. Trust is fragile, and systems of communication depend on it absolutely. No matter how well roads were built or how fast coaches ran, the post was only as strong as the honesty of the person who carried it. The harsh punishments reflected this truth. By making examples of convicted postmasters, the government was not just punishing theft, it was protecting the illusion of reliability that the postal system required to function. Without trust, letters would stop flowing, trade would falter, and families would be isolated. In this sense, every stolen letter was more than a crime, it was an assault on the fabric of society. Reflection, whispers in the dark. So imagine again the rural postmaster sitting in a candle-lit room, weighing envelopes in his hands. Each one is a sealed secret, a trust placed in him by neighbors who believe he will honor it. Some of those letters reach their destination untouched, others do not. The inspectors arrive, the trial follows, and the community reels in shock. But even as justice is served, a question lingers. How many letters vanished silently? their words never read, their secrets never known, and how many betrayals were buried with the postmasters who took them. Story 6. The Case of the Stolen Manhole Covers in Cold War Poland. Warsaw, 1962. A tram rattles down Marszałkowska Street, its wheels screeching as it takes the corner. Pedestrians crowd the pavement, their bags heavy with cabbage, bread, or black market cigarettes. The city hums with the sounds of recovery and repression, industry and rationing. And then, suddenly, a man vanishes. His foot plunges into an open hole where a manhole cover should have been. The passerby survives, bruised but shaken. The culprit is not sabotage nor accident, it is theft. A society of shortages. To understand why manhole covers disappeared, you must understand the society in which they lay. Post-war Poland, like much of the Eastern Bloc, was defined by shortages. The state owned factories, controlled trade, and dictated production quotas. But while ideology promised equality, reality delivered scarcity. Basic goods, shoes, fuel, meat, even soap were difficult to come by. Lines stretched for hours outside shops, and rumors of incoming deliveries spread like wildfire. In such an environment, anything with material value became vulnerable. Steel and iron were especially prized. Heavy industries consumed them voraciously, yet consumer demand and state inefficiency left gaps that criminals eagerly filled. To a thief, a manhole cover was not infrastructure, it was raw material, a slab of iron that could be sold as scrap. Why manhole covers? The humble manhole cover might seem an unlikely target, but each weighed anywhere from 40 to 70 kilograms of cast iron. In a scrapyard, that mass could be exchanged for cash, vodka, or favors. For thieves struggling to survive or simply seeking profit, it was a windfall lying in plain sight. Stealing one was not complicated. At night, under cover of darkness, thieves pried the covers loose with crowbars. Some loaded them onto carts or wheelbarrows, others rolled them down streets until they reached waiting trucks. By dawn, the covers were gone, melted down in furnaces or hidden among legitimate scrap metal shipments. The dangers left behind. The thefts left cities in peril. Open manholes yawned in streets and sidewalks, invisible in the dark or covered by snow. Pedestrians stumbled in, breaking ankles or worse. Cyclists were thrown headlong. In the worst cases, cars and trams hit the holes at speed, causing accidents and injuries. Newspapers occasionally reported tragedies. A child disappearing into a sewer during a game of chase. An elderly woman struck unconscious after falling through an unmarked hole. These stories spread fear, reminding people that even walking home at night carried hidden dangers. Symbol of a broken system. The missing covers became more than a hazard. They became a symbol. Citizens joked bitterly that in Poland, even the ground beneath your feet is not safe. The thefts revealed not only the desperation of individuals, but the fragility of a state that could not protect its own infrastructure. Officials denounced the thefts as anti-socialist crimes, lumping them with black market dealing and sabotage. But their lectures rang hollow to citizens who knew that the real culprit was scarcity. If the state had provided enough, there would be no need to steal. The police response. Authorities treated the thefts with seriousness, though their methods were often clumsy. Patrols were increased in neighborhoods with repeated thefts, and scrapyards were ordered to demand documentation for all metal deliveries. But corruption and bribery undermined enforcement. Many scrapyards looked the other way, happy to take the metal as long as profit could be made. Occasionally, police staged crackdowns. In Krakow in 1965, for example, a ring of thieves was caught with more than 100 covers stacked in a warehouse, ready to be smuggled east. The men were paraded in court as examples, sentenced to prison terms meant to scare others. Yet within weeks, new thefts occurred. The reality was simple. As long as metal was scarce, demand would exist, and as long as demand existed, manhole covers would continue to vanish. Voices of the people. Letters to newspapers capture the frustration. One reader in Lodz wrote in 1971, "Comrade editor, I ask only this. Must I walk with my eyes on the ground like a dog for fear that the pavement itself will betray me? Are we citizens, or are we prey for thieves?" Another, more cynical, joked, "If manhole covers can vanish, perhaps one day the streets will too, carried away to the scrap yards. Will we then walk only in mud or float in the air?" The humor masked genuine anger. People expected little luxury from the state, but they demanded at least the safety of their streets. International echoes. Poland was not alone. Similar thefts plagued other Eastern Bloc countries, East Germany, Hungary, even the Soviet Union. In Moscow, a wave of missing covers in the 1970s led to rumors of organized gangs tied to corrupt factory managers. The problem was not uniquely Polish but systemic, born from a shared culture of scarcity. Yet in Poland, where cynicism ran deep and jokes about shortages filled kitchens, the stolen covers became a kind of dark folklore. They were proof that absurdity had become normal. Unresolved ending. So picture it, a snowy Warsaw night, the glow of street lamps casting long shadows. A worker hurries home, bag heavy with bread. He steps onto the pavement and the ground gives way. The cover is gone. The newspapers blame antisocial elements. The police vow justice. But the question lingers: was this crime the work of greedy criminals, or simply another crack in a system already sinking under its own weight? By the late 1960s, manhole cover theft had grown too widespread to be dismissed as isolated mischief. The disappearances endangered lives, disrupted traffic, and embarrassed officials who prided themselves on orderly socialist modernity. What use was a grand parade of tanks through Warsaw if ordinary citizens could not walk home safely without tumbling into an uncovered sewer? The state needed to act, and so began a series of crackdowns that revealed not only the creativity of thieves, but also the contradictions of the regime that hunted them. Police stings and patrols. The Ministry of the Interior launched patrols specifically tasked with monitoring vulnerable streets. In some cities, officers disguised themselves as workers, loitering near suspected theft zones in hopes of catching culprits in the act. One Warsaw police report from 1968 described officers hiding in stairwells overnight, waiting to hear the telltale clang of iron being pried loose. When two young men attempted to roll a cover onto a cart, they were arrested before they reached the corner. The covers weighed 60 kilos each. The men had planned to take 3. But these arrests were the exception, not the rule. Thieves adapted quickly, working in groups, moving fast, and timing their thefts to coincide with power outages or diversions. The police could not watch every street, and covers continued to vanish. Scrapyards and the black market. Authorities recognized that the real choke point was not the street, but the scrapyard. Stolen covers had no value unless someone would buy them. Thus, inspectors were sent to audit yards, demanding receipts and searching for irregularities. Some yards complied, but many did not. Managers accepted bribes or fabricated paperwork, marking stolen covers as industrial scrap. In one notorious case in Katowice, investigators discovered a scrapyard that had processed over 400 covers in a single year, blending them seamlessly with legitimate metal shipments destined for state factories. The yard's owner was arrested, but his defense revealed the system's flaws. He argued that quotas demanded impossible amounts of scrap metal, and without unofficial channels, his yard would fail. His words struck a nerve. In a system built on unrealistic production targets, corruption was not an exception, it was survival. Ingenuity of the thieves. As police and inspectors tightened controls, thieves grew more inventive. Some began disguising themselves as municipal workers, complete with stolen uniforms and forged papers. Neighbors, seeing men in orange vests and caps lifting covers into trucks, assumed they were official crews. By the time suspicion arose, the thieves were gone. Others used creative transport. A man in Krakow was caught pushing a baby pram down the street, inside of which were two stolen covers covered by blankets. In Gdansk, police stopped a horse-drawn cart filled with hay, only to discover a dozen covers hidden beneath. Stories circulated of covers floated down rivers on rafts, or smuggled onto freight trains under loads of coal. The ingenuity bordered on absurdity, but the absurdity was itself a product of desperation. Citizens on edge. Ordinary people bore the brunt of the danger. Newspapers were filled with reports of accidents. Cyclists hurled from their bikes, buses jolted into sudden swerves, pedestrians breaking bones. Parents warned their children not to run in the streets after dark. Teachers told pupils to step lightly, watch the ground. Urban life became tinged with paranoia, as if the earth itself could open beneath one's feet. Yet frustration turned not only against thieves but against the state. Citizens asked why manhole covers so basic, so essential could not be safeguarded. Letters to editors demanded accountability, but official replies were boilerplate condemnations of antisocial behavior. The underlying problem, scarcity, was never acknowledged. A case in Krakow. Perhaps the most famous crackdown occurred in Krakow in 1972. Police, acting on a tip, raided a warehouse on the city's outskirts and found a staggering 128 manhole covers, stacked like coins against the walls. The thieves had operated for months, stealing a few covers at a time and hiding them until a buyer could be arranged. The case became a public spectacle. The men were paraded in front of the press as symbols of greed. Newspapers described them as jackals gnawing at the bones of the people's city. They were sentenced to long prison terms. And yet, within weeks of their arrest, new thefts were reported in Warsaw, Lodz, and Poznan. The spectacle had satisfied the demand for justice but solved little. Humor and the absurd. As the thefts persisted, so did the jokes. Polish humor, already rich with satire about shortages and bureaucracy, found fertile ground in the missing covers. One joke ran, "Why did the man fall in Warsaw? Because socialism removed the ground beneath his feet." Another, "A thief stole a manhole cover. When asked why, he replied, 'At least this way I can cover my own holes at home.'" Such humor softened the fear, but also highlighted the absurd contradiction of the system. A government powerful enough to deploy tanks against protesters was somehow powerless to keep iron plates in the ground. State propaganda. Faced with public ridicule, the state attempted to reclaim the narrative. Official publications warned citizens that manhole cover theft was not merely petty crime, but sabotage against the socialist order. This language reframed thieves not as desperate men seeking scrap, but as enemies of the state, a convenient way to deflect attention from the shortages driving the thefts. Yet citizens rarely believed it. In kitchens and tram stops, they whispered what everyone knew, that the thefts were not sabotage but survival, and that the state's rhetoric was as hollow as the streets left uncovered. Unresolved ending. So imagine a winter night in Lodz. Snow falls softly, muffling the city. A cart creaks down an alley, its wheels rattling with hidden weight. A manhole stands open in the square, dark and waiting. Tomorrow, a worker will trip, a cyclist will fall, and the newspapers will once again denounce enemies of order. But the deeper question remains. Were the real criminals the thieves with crowbars, or the system that left metal so scarce that even the streets could be stolen? By the late 1970s, the epidemic of manhole cover theft that had plagued Poland for decades began to wane. The streets were still dangerous, accidents still occurred, but the scale of the thefts lessened. The state congratulated itself on restoring order, yet the real reasons behind the decline were more complex, a mixture of adaptation, exhaustion, and systemic change. How the thefts declined. One, materials changed. Municipalities began experimenting with alternative materials. Some covers were replaced with reinforced concrete mixed with scrap metal, making them less valuable to thieves. Others were redesigned with locking mechanisms that required specialized tools to remove, raising the risk for would-be rustlers. 2. Increased surveillance. Though underfunded, the police slowly adapted. Patrol routes incorporated vulnerable intersections, and scrapyards faced tighter audits. Inspectors were rotated regularly to disrupt corruption networks. These measures did not end theft, but they raised the cost of getting caught. 3. Diminished payoff. Over time, the economics shifted. The value of cast iron relative to the risk of prison decreased, particularly as black market opportunities expanded in other commodities like fuel and electronics. Thieves turned to smuggling Western goods or dealing in rationed luxuries, leaving manhole covers behind. The lingering dangers. Even as theft declined, the memory of it haunted cities. Citizens walked with caution, eyes scanning the ground for gaps. Parents told their children not to run through squares or down alleys. Cyclists carried torches to scan the pavement at night. Tragic accidents never disappeared entirely. Newspapers occasionally reported deaths or injuries from uncovered sewers well into the 1980s, reminders that infrastructure in the Eastern Bloc was always precarious. The fear persisted, that the earth itself could open beneath one's feet, that public safety was negotiable in the face of scarcity. Political consequences. For the state, the thefts were more than inconvenience, they were humiliation. In a system that prided itself on centralized control, the inability to safeguard something as simple as a manhole cover exposed the limits of its power. The thefts fed public cynicism. When party officials lectured about the strength of socialism, ordinary citizens rolled their eyes and muttered about holes in the street. Jokes about missing covers became shorthand for the absurdity of daily life under communism, a reminder that lofty rhetoric meant little if you could not walk home without risking a broken leg. Symbolism and scarcity. In hindsight, the theft of manhole covers was not really about iron. It was about scarcity itself. When a society cannot provide, every object becomes currency. A cover was no longer infrastructure but a slab of metal to be traded for food, drink, or favor. Scarcity warps value. It turns the ordinary into the coveted, the absurd into the logical. That manhole covers could vanish from beneath the feet of thousands shows how deeply scarcity defined life in Cold War Poland. Citizens' ingenuity. Just as thieves adapted, so did ordinary citizens. Some communities began painting bright rings around covers so that missing ones could be spotted more quickly. Others organized neighborhood patrols, unofficial groups of residents who kept watch at night. Mothers warned children to walk like foxes, with your eyes low, and men carried sticks to test the ground in dimly lit streets. These adaptations reflected the resilience of a people who had long learned to survive in a system that provided little security. The afterlife of the theft. When communism collapsed in 1989, Poland's new government faced mountains of reforms, from economic restructuring to political transformation. The problem of missing manhole covers, once headline news, became a footnote. New materials, freer markets, and modernized infrastructure gradually ended the practice. Yet the memory lingered. In the 1990s, Western journalists visiting Warsaw or Krakow often noted the folklore of missing covers, hearing locals joke that under communism, even the streets themselves were stolen. To this day, in some Polish cities, manhole covers bear special engravings or designs, not only to deter theft, but as quiet acknowledgement of the strange history that once made them disappear. Reflection, lessons beneath our feet. The story of the stolen manhole covers may sound absurd, almost comic when compared to great heists or violent crimes. But its significance lies precisely in its ordinariness. It reveals how crime thrives not only in shadows but in shortages, how scarcity turns infrastructure into loot, and how survival can blur the line between necessity and sabotage. It also shows how systems collapse not in grand explosions but in small, daily failures. A letter stolen from the post, a cheese wheel rolled from a barn, a manhole cover lifted from the street. Each theft chips away at trust until citizens learn not only to distrust their leaders but even the ground beneath their feet.